Welcome, dear listeners, to another episode of Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're taking a gentle journey back through the golden sands of time to explore the surprisingly tedious reality of life as an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. While popular culture has painted these rulers as glamorous god-kings living lives of endless luxury, the truth is far more mundane and, frankly, quite exhausting. Picture, if you will, the soft glow of dawn breaking over the limestone walls of a pharaoh's palace complex. The year is approximately 1400 BCE, during the height of the New Kingdom. Our pharaoh stirs not to the gentle caress of natural sunlight, but to the methodical chanting of priests who have been stationed outside his chambers since well before sunrise. There is no snooze button in ancient Egypt, no leisurely morning coffee, no scrolling through social media while still in bed. The moment consciousness returns to our divine ruler, the relentless machinery of royal protocol springs into action. A procession of servants, each with their specific role rehearsed countless times, files into the bedchamber. The pharaoh cannot simply get up and stretch. Every movement must be deliberate, measured, and in accordance with ancient tradition. The first servant approaches with a basin of sacred water, drawn from the Nile at precisely the right time of day, when the sun, god Ra, has blessed it with the proper divine essence. The pharaoh must be cleansed in a specific order, starting with the hands, then the face, moving systematically down the body. Each splash of water is accompanied by a muttered incantation. The servant cannot deviate from this routine, and neither can the pharaoh. Next comes the ritual of dressing, which would make even the most elaborate modern fashion show seem hastily thrown together. The pharaoh doesn't simply put on clothes. Each garment has symbolic meaning. Each piece of jewelry represents a divine attribute. Each cosmetic application serves a religious purpose. The process takes nearly 2 hours. First, the undergarments, made of the finest linen, are carefully arranged. The quality of linen was so important to Egyptian society that it served as a form of currency. The pharaoh's undergarments alone would have been worth more than most people's annual income. But comfort was secondary to symbolism. The linen had to be perfectly white, representing purity, and woven in specific patterns that honored various gods. Then comes the application of cosmetics, which served both religious and practical purposes. The famous black kohl around the eyes wasn't just for dramatic effect. It helped reduce glare from the desert sun and was believed to ward off evil spirits. But applying it correctly required steady hands and precise technique. Too little, and the pharaoh appeared weak. Too much, and he violated sacred proportions established by the gods. The green malachite powder on the eyelids had to be applied in exact quantities, mixed with oils that had been blessed by specific priests on specific days. The process of selecting and applying the pharaoh's crown alone could take 30 minutes. There wasn't just one crown, but different crowns for different occasions, different times of day, different religious ceremonies. The red crown of Lower Egypt, the white crown of Upper Egypt, the double crown that combined both, the blue crown for military occasions, the Nemes headdress for formal portraits. Each crown weighed several pounds and had to be positioned exactly right to maintain the pharaoh's divine image. By the time our pharaoh is finally dressed and crowned, it's nearly mid-morning, and the real work of the day hasn't even begun. But first, breakfast, which is another elaborate ritual in itself. The pharaoh cannot simply eat when hungry. Meals are served at specific times, in specific sequences, with specific prayers and offerings to the gods. The dining hall is arranged according to strict protocol. The pharaoh sits on a throne-like chair at a table made of imported ebony, inlaid with ivory and gold. Before him are arranged dozens of dishes, most of which he will barely touch. There are roasted fowl, fresh fish from the Nile, bread baked in sacred ovens, fruits and vegetables from the royal gardens, honey cakes, wine, beer, and milk. But the pharaoh must first offer a portion of each dish to the gods, reciting specific prayers for each food item. The bread alone requires a 15-minute blessing ceremony. Bread was the staff of life in ancient Egypt, and the pharaoh's bread was baked with flour ground from grain, blessed by the priests of the harvest goddess. The pharaoh must break the bread in a specific pattern, offer the first piece to the gods, the second piece to his ancestors, and only then can he eat the third piece himself, and he cannot eat alone. Surrounding him are court officials, priests, advisors, and family members, each seated according to their rank and relationship to the pharaoh. Conversation during meals follows strict protocols. Certain topics can only be discussed at certain times. The pharaoh must acknowledge each person present in order of importance. A simple breakfast becomes a diplomatic exercise requiring careful attention to hierarchy and etiquette. After breakfast comes the morning religious ceremonies, which are perhaps the most crucial part of the pharaoh's day. As the living embodiment of the god Horus and the son of Ra, the pharaoh has specific duties to perform to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order that keeps the universe functioning properly. If the pharaoh fails in these duties, the consequences could be catastrophic. The Nile might not flood, crops might fail, enemies might invade, chaos might overcome order. The pharaoh must visit the main temple complex, where he performs the daily ritual of awakening the gods. This involves entering the innermost sanctuary, where the sacred statues of the gods reside, and performing a series of increasingly complex ceremonies. He must anoint each statue with sacred oils, dress them in fresh linens, offer them food and drink, and recite hundreds of lines of liturgy in ancient Egyptian, which by this time period was already becoming an archaic language that required years of study to master properly. The pressure on the pharaoh during these ceremonies is immense. Every word must be pronounced correctly, every gesture must be precise, every offering must be properly prepared and presented. A single mistake could anger the gods and bring disaster upon Egypt. Imagine trying to remember hundreds of pages of religious text, performing complex rituals, all while wearing heavy ceremonial regalia, and knowing that the survival of your entire civilization depends on your getting it right. And these aren't quick ceremonies. The morning temple rituals alone take approximately 3 hours. 3 hours of standing, chanting, making offerings, burning incense, and maintaining perfect composure while sweat pours down your face under layers of heavy clothing and a several-pound crown. By the time the morning religious duties are complete, it's early afternoon, and the pharaoh can finally turn his attention to the business of actually governing Egypt. But even this isn't as simple as making executive decisions. Every aspect of governance is wrapped in layers of protocol, bureaucracy, and religious symbolism. The pharaoh holds court in a vast throne room designed to overwhelm visitors with the power and majesty of divine kingship. The throne itself is a work of art, carved from precious wood, overlaid with gold, and embedded with jewels. But it's also uncomfortable, designed more for symbolic impact than human ergonomics. The pharaoh must sit perfectly upright, maintaining a godlike pose for hours at a time. Before him parade a seemingly endless stream of officials, petitioners, foreign ambassadors, and court functionaries. Each person must follow strict protocols for approaching the pharaoh. They must prostrate themselves, speak only when spoken to, and address the pharaoh using the proper titles and honorifics. The pharaoh, meanwhile, must listen to each petition, render judgment, and respond in a way that maintains his divine authority, while actually solving practical problems. The types of issues brought before the pharaoh would be familiar to any modern executive, but the process for addressing them is mind-numbingly bureaucratic. A dispute between two farmers over water rights becomes a complex legal proceeding involving multiple levels of officials, religious considerations about the sacred nature of the Nile, and careful attention to precedents set by previous pharaohs. What should be a simple decision about irrigation takes hours of deliberation. Trade negotiations with foreign powers require even more careful attention. Egypt was the dominant power in the ancient world during much of the pharaonic period, but maintaining that dominance required constant diplomatic maneuvering. The pharaoh must balance the competing interests of various court factions, consider the religious implications of different policies, and project strength while avoiding unnecessarily provoking potential enemies. And through it all, the pharaoh must maintain the appearance of divine omniscience. He cannot admit uncertainty, cannot ask for clarification, cannot show fatigue or frustration. Every decision must appear to flow naturally from his divine wisdom, even when dealing with technical details about mining operations, construction projects, or military logistics that would challenge any modern specialist. The administrative burden alone would be overwhelming for any modern CEO, but the pharaoh must handle it while maintaining religious authority, political stability, and divine status. There are no vacation days, no weekends, no sick leave. The gods don't take breaks, and neither can their earthly representative. As afternoon wears into evening, the pharaoh's schedule remains packed. There are more religious ceremonies to perform, more officials to meet with, more decisions to make. Dinner is another elaborate ritual, followed by evening temple services, followed by private meetings with advisors who brief him on intelligence reports, military situations, and potential threats to his rule. The pharaoh must be constantly vigilant against palace intrigue. In a system where the pharaoh wields absolute power, everyone around him is either plotting to gain influence or plotting to remove him. Family members scheme against each other for succession rights. Court officials form factions and alliances that shift like desert sands. Foreign powers attempt to infiltrate the court with spies and assassins. Even the pharaoh's own wives and children present potential threats. Polygamy was common among pharaohs, both for diplomatic reasons and to ensure the succession. But multiple wives meant multiple sets of interests, multiple potential heirs, and multiple sources of conflict. The pharaoh had to carefully balance the competing demands of different wives while ensuring that succession disputes didn't tear the kingdom apart. The famous practice of royal incest, where pharaohs married their sisters or daughters, was partly an attempt to simplify these succession issues by keeping power within a small circle of trusted family members. But incestuous marriages created their own problems, including genetic disorders that plagued royal bloodlines and psychological tensions that would challenge any family dynamic. Consider the pharaoh Akhenaten, who married his own daughter and attempted to revolutionize Egyptian religion by introducing monotheistic worship of the sun disk, Aten. The psychological strain of maintaining such unconventional relationships while implementing radical religious reforms contributed to a reign marked by instability and conflict that nearly destroyed the Egyptian empire. Even basic social interactions were complicated by the pharaoh's divine status. He couldn't simply have friends in any normal sense. Every relationship was filtered through considerations of power, status, and religious significance. Casual conversation was impossible when every word might be interpreted as divine pronouncement. The pharaoh lived in a gilded cage, surrounded by people who either worshipped him or feared him, but who could never relate to him as a fellow human being. The physical demands of pharaonic life were also considerable. The ceremonial regalia was heavy and uncomfortable. The crown alone could weigh 5 pounds, worn for hours at a time in the blazing Egyptian sun. The formal clothing was made of thick, layered fabrics that provided impressive visual impact, but little comfort in a desert climate. Public appearances required the pharaoh to maintain perfect composure regardless of physical discomfort. He had to stand for hours during ceremonies, walk in elaborate processions across burning sand, and perform physically demanding rituals without showing any signs of fatigue or distress. The god king couldn't sweat visibly, couldn't stumble, couldn't show any human weakness that might undermine his divine authority. The pharaoh's diet was strictly regulated for both religious and practical reasons. Certain foods were forbidden at certain times of year. Others required elaborate preparation rituals. The pharaoh couldn't simply grab a snack when hungry. Every meal had to be planned, prepared, and blessed according to complex protocols. Even sleep was regulated. The pharaoh's bedchamber was arranged according to religious principles, with the bed positioned to align with cosmic forces. Protective amulets and spells surrounded the sleeping area to guard against evil spirits and assassination attempts. But the pharaoh couldn't simply sleep when tired. Bedtime rituals included prayers, offerings, and ceremonial preparations that could take an hour or more, and sleep itself was often interrupted by religious duties. The pharaoh was expected to maintain spiritual communication with the gods through dreams and visions. Palace priests would wake him at specific times during the night to perform additional ceremonies tied to the movement of stars and planets. A full night's uninterrupted sleep was a luxury the pharaoh could rarely afford. The psychological toll of this lifestyle would be enormous. Imagine living every moment of your life according to someone else's script, never being able to express spontaneous emotion, never being able to admit uncertainty or weakness, never being able to form genuine personal relationships. The pharaoh was essentially a prisoner of his own divine status, trapped in a role that demanded superhuman perfection from a fundamentally human being. Many pharaohs seem to have coped with these pressures by developing what we might today recognize as obsessive-compulsive behaviors. They became fixated on controlling every detail of their environment, from the precise arrangement of palace furniture to the exact wording of religious inscriptions. This need for control extended to their preparations for the afterlife, where they spent enormous resources building elaborate tombs and collecting grave goods that would ensure their comfort in death. The construction of these tombs provides perhaps the clearest example of how tedious and burdensome pharaonic life could be. A pharaoh typically began planning his tomb immediately upon taking the throne, and the project would consume a significant portion of his reign. He had to approve every detail of the design, from the overall layout to the specific pigments used in wall paintings. The process involved countless meetings with architects, artists, and religious specialists. Every room had to be positioned correctly according to cosmic principles. Every decoration had to conform to strict religious guidelines. Every grave good had to be properly consecrated and blessed. The pharaoh spent years of his life in tedious planning sessions for a tomb he hoped not to use for decades, and the cost was staggering. Building a royal tomb required mobilizing thousands of workers, consuming vast quantities of precious materials, and diverting resources that could have been used for infrastructure, military defense, or public welfare. The pharaoh had to balance his desire for eternal glory against the practical needs of governing a living kingdom. The famous tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered largely intact in 1922, gives us some idea of the scale of these burial preparations. Despite being a relatively minor pharaoh who died young, Tutankhamun was buried with over 5,000 individual objects, including furniture, jewelry, weapons, clothing, food, and ceremonial items. Each object had to be specially made or selected, blessed by priests, and carefully placed in the tomb according to religious requirements. For a major pharaoh like Ramesses II, who ruled for 66 years and had ample time to prepare, the scale of burial preparations would have been even more elaborate. His tomb in the Valley of the Kings contains dozens of chambers and corridors, all decorated with intricate paintings and filled with grave goods. The planning and construction of such a tomb would have been a full-time job for hundreds of people over several decades. But even the most elaborate preparations couldn't guarantee security in the afterlife. Most royal tombs were robbed within a few centuries of their construction, sometimes within decades. The pharaohs spent enormous effort and resources preparing for an eternity that was often cut short by the greed of tomb robbers who saw their burial goods as treasure rather than sacred objects. The irony is striking. The pharaohs lived lives of incredible restriction and formality, bound by endless protocols and religious obligations, all in service of maintaining their divine status and preparing for eternal glory. Yet most of them were ultimately forgotten by history, their tombs plundered, their mummies scattered, and their names erased from official records by successors who wanted to claim credit for their achievements. Consider the case of Hatshepsut, one of the few female pharaohs to rule Egypt in her own right. She spent over 20 years carefully building her legitimacy, commissioning elaborate temples and monuments to establish her divine authority. She even had herself depicted with the traditional false beard of kingship to conform to masculine expectations of pharaonic power. Yet after her death, her successor, Thutmose III, systematically destroyed her monuments and removed her name from official records, attempting to erase her from history entirely. The daily routine of managing Egypt's vast bureaucracy would have been mind-numbing in its complexity. Egypt during the New Kingdom period controlled territory from Nubia in the south to parts of the Levant in the north. Administering this empire required constant attention to reports from provincial governors, military commanders, tax collectors, and trade officials. Each day brought stacks of papyrus documents requiring the pharaoh's attention. Tax collection reports from Upper Egypt, grain storage inventories from Lower Egypt. Military intelligence about Hittite movements in Syria, diplomatic correspondence from Mesopotamian kings, trade negotiations with Mediterranean merchants. Construction progress reports from temple building projects across the empire. The pharaoh couldn't simply delegate these decisions to subordinates. His divine authority meant that major policy decisions had to come from him personally. But the technical complexity of many issues would have required expertise that no single person could possess. How could one individual master the intricacies of military strategy, agricultural management, international diplomacy, religious theology, architectural engineering, and economic policy. Yet the pharaoh was expected to render wise decisions on all these topics while maintaining the appearance of divine omniscience. He couldn't admit ignorance or uncertainty without undermining his sacred authority. This must have created enormous psychological pressure, forcing pharaohs to make important decisions based on incomplete understanding while pretending to divine wisdom. The religious obligations alone would have been exhausting. Egypt had hundreds of gods, each with their own temples, festivals, and ritual requirements. The pharaoh was the high priest of every temple in Egypt, theoretically responsible for maintaining proper relationships with all these deities. While he obviously couldn't personally perform every religious ceremony, he had to at least oversee the major festivals and ensure that proper protocols were followed. The annual Opet festival, for example, required the pharaoh to participate in elaborate processions and ceremonies lasting several weeks. During this festival, the sacred statues of the gods Amun, Mut, and Khonsu were carried from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple in grand processions that involved thousands of participants. The pharaoh had to play a central role in these ceremonies, performing specific rituals at designated points along the route. But the Opet festival was just one of dozens of major religious celebrations throughout the year. There were harvest festivals, flood festivals, astronomical festivals tied to the movements of stars and planets, and commemorative festivals honoring deceased pharaohs. Each festival had its own complex requirements for the pharaoh's participation. Between festivals, there were daily temple rituals that required the pharaoh's oversight. The most important of these was the daily Awakening of the God ceremony performed at dawn in major temples throughout Egypt. During this ritual, priests would symbolically wake up the god by opening the doors of the innermost shrine, washing and clothing the god statue, and presenting offerings of food and drink. While local priests performed most of these daily ceremonies, the pharaoh was expected to participate personally in the most important temples, particularly during significant astronomical events or times of crisis. This meant that his schedule was often dictated by religious calendar requirements rather than administrative convenience. The pharaoh's role in maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order, also extended to judicial responsibilities that would have been both tedious and stressful. As the ultimate source of justice in Egypt, the pharaoh was the final court of appeal for legal disputes throughout the kingdom. While local magistrates handled routine cases, serious crimes and complex civil disputes could be appealed to the pharaoh's court. Egyptian legal procedures were elaborate and time-consuming. Evidence had to be presented according to strict protocols. Witnesses had to be examined under oath to the gods. Written documents had to be authenticated by multiple officials. The pharaoh had to weigh all this evidence while considering not only the facts of the case but also the political and religious implications of his decision. A seemingly simple property dispute between two nobles could have far-reaching consequences for regional stability. A criminal case involving a provincial governor could affect relationships with foreign. The pharaoh's afternoon was a labyrinth of political maneuvering and administrative burden that would test even the most astute minds. As the sacred morning rituals concluded and the incense smoke dispersed through the temple corridors, the real work of governing an empire spanning from Nubia to the Levant would begin in earnest. The weight of divine responsibility settled upon the pharaoh's shoulders like his heavy ceremonial regalia, each decision carrying consequences that could ripple through the kingdom for generations. The royal court assembled in the great audience hall, a cavernous space designed to intimidate and inspire in equal measure. towering columns painted with scenes of the pharaoh's divine victories stretched toward a ceiling decorated with golden stars against a deep blue background, representing the eternal heavens where the pharaoh would one day take his rightful place among the gods. The throne itself was a masterwork of symbolic artistry, carved from ebony and inlaid with gold, its armrests shaped like lions to represent the pharaoh's fierce protective power over his subjects. Seated upon this magnificent throne, the pharaoh would receive an endless parade of petitioners, each seeking royal judgment on matters both trivial and momentous. A dispute between neighboring farmers over irrigation rights might be followed by a diplomatic crisis requiring delicate negotiation with Hittite ambassadors. The pharaoh was expected to demonstrate Solomon-like wisdom in every decision, his divine nature supposedly granting him perfect insight into matters of justice and statecraft. The pressure to maintain this facade of omniscience was relentless, particularly when dealing with cases where the facts were murky or the stakes politically charged. The bureaucratic machinery of ancient Egypt was vast and complex, requiring constant oversight from the pharaoh and his most trusted advisors. Reports would arrive throughout the afternoon, detailing everything from grain harvests in remote provinces to the progress of construction projects on temples and monuments. Each document demanded the pharaoh's attention, as his seal of approval was required for expenditures, appointments, and policy changes. The sheer volume of administrative work was staggering, yet the pharaoh could delegate only so much without appearing weak or disengaged from the kingdom's affairs. Military matters commanded particular urgency during these afternoon sessions. Generals would present intelligence about potential threats along Egypt's borders, while garrison commanders sought approval for troop movements and fortification improvements. The pharaoh's role as supreme military leader was not merely ceremonial. He was expected to understand strategy and tactics, to inspire his soldiers through personal charisma, and to make split-second decisions that could determine the fate of entire campaigns. The burden of sending young men to their deaths in foreign wars weighed heavily on some pharaohs, though others seemed to relish the opportunity to expand their empire's boundaries. The intricacies of palace politics added another layer of complexity to the pharaoh's afternoon responsibilities. Courtiers jockeyed for position and favor, their elaborate schemes and counter-schemes creating a web of intrigue that the pharaoh had to navigate with extreme care. A misplaced word of praise or a perceived slight could trigger feuds that might last for years, potentially destabilizing the entire court structure. The pharaoh's wives and children were often the most dangerous players in these political games, their ambitions for power and position driving them to extraordinary lengths of manipulation and betrayal. Religious obligations continued throughout the afternoon, as the pharaoh's divine status required constant reinforcement through ritual and ceremony. Priests would approach seeking approval for new festivals, guidance on theological disputes, or resources for temple maintenance. The pharaoh walked a delicate line between supporting the powerful priesthood that legitimized his rule and preventing them from accumulating too much independent authority. The memory of pharaohs who had been overthrown by ambitious high priests served as a constant reminder of the dangers inherent in this relationship. Economic decisions demanded careful consideration during these afternoon councils. Trade agreements with foreign merchants required royal approval, as did major infrastructure projects like canal construction or pyramid building. The pharaoh had to balance the kingdom's immediate needs against long-term prosperity, while also considering the political implications of his economic choices. Favoring one region or social class over another could create dangerous resentments. Yet the kingdom's resources were finite and difficult choices were inevitable. The psychological toll of these endless decisions and responsibilities was immense. Modern leaders at least have the comfort of knowing their terms of office will eventually end, but the pharaoh's burden was literally eternal. Even in death, he would continue to bear responsibility for his people's welfare, his mummified form serving as a conduit between the mortal world and the divine realm. The weight of this cosmic responsibility contributed to the notorious paranoia and increasingly erratic behavior that characterized many pharaohs' later years. Personal relationships became casualties of the pharaoh's exalted position. Trust was a luxury few could afford when surrounded by individuals whose loyalty might be bought or coerced. Even family members posed potential threats, their proximity to power making them natural focal points for ambitious conspiracies. The pharaoh's children, rather than being sources of comfort and joy, often became pawns in succession struggles that could tear the royal household apart. The practice of royal incest, while intended to preserve divine bloodlines, created its own psychological pressures and genetic complications that further isolated the pharaoh from normal human connections. The afternoon would typically conclude with private consultations between the pharaoh and his most trusted advisors. These intimate sessions, held away from the prying eyes and ears of the broader court, were where the most sensitive decisions were made. Here, the pharaoh could drop some of his divine facade and engage in frank discussions about the kingdom's challenges and opportunities. Yet even in these private moments, the burden of absolute authority remained crushing, as the pharaoh alone bore final responsibility for every choice and its consequences. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, symbolically beginning its nightly journey through the underworld, the pharaoh would prepare for the evening's ceremonial obligations. But the weight of the day's decisions would follow him into the night, manifesting in troubled dreams and restless sleep. The crown that had seemed so glorious in youth often became an unbearable burden by middle age, its golden weight a constant reminder of the isolation and responsibility that defined the pharaoh's existence. The evening hours brought their own unique challenges and obligations for the divine ruler of Egypt. As the sacred bark of Ra began its perilous journey through the underworld, the pharaoh's duties shifted from the purely administrative to the deeply mystical, requiring him to serve as humanity's representative in cosmic dramas that determine the fate of all creation. The transition from day to night was not merely a natural phenomenon, but a critical juncture where the forces of order and chaos clashed in eternal battle. The royal banquet hall would come alive with carefully orchestrated pageantry, designed to reinforce the pharaoh's divine status while providing necessary relaxation after the day's exhausting responsibilities. Musicians playing harps, lyres, and flutes would fill the air with haunting melodies that spoke of ancient mysteries and eternal truths. Dancers moved with fluid grace, their performances telling stories of the gods' adventures and the pharaoh's own legendary deeds. Yet even these moments of apparent leisure served political purposes, as the guest list and seating arrangements conveyed subtle messages about favor and influence within the court hierarchy. The evening meal itself was a ritual laden with symbolic meaning. Each dish served to the pharaoh had been blessed by priests and tested for poison by trusted servants, reflecting the constant danger that surrounded even the most basic aspects of royal life. The pharaoh's food was prepared according to strict religious guidelines,
with certain items forbidden during specific lunar phases or religious festivals. Even the act of eating became a performance of divine authority, as courtiers watched in reverent silence while their god-king consumed sustenance that would maintain his supernatural vitality.
Private audiences with family members often took place during these evening hours, though even these intimate encounters were governed by rigid protocol and careful observation. The pharaoh's wives and children approached him with the same ceremonial deference shown by foreign ambassadors, their personal relationships subordinated to the demands of divine kingship. Conversations about family matters inevitably became entangled with discussions of succession, political alliances, and dynastic strategy, making genuine emotional connection nearly impossible to achieve or maintain. The pharaoh's harem presented its own complex web of obligations and dangers during the evening hours, with dozens or even hundreds of wives and concubines competing for royal attention. The pharaoh had to navigate carefully between showing appropriate favor to his great royal wife, while not completely alienating secondary wives whose families might pose political threats if offended. The pressure to produce male heirs was constant, as the stability of the entire kingdom depended on a clear line of succession. Yet the very act of fathering children created new vulnerabilities, as ambitious mothers might plot to advance their sons' claims to the throne through any means necessary. Evening religious ceremonies required the pharaoh's participation in rituals designed to ensure Ra's successful passage through the underworld and his eventual rebirth at dawn. These rites often took place in hidden chambers deep within the palace complex, where the pharaoh would commune directly with the gods through meditation, prayer, and sometimes more esoteric practices involving sacred substances and altered states of consciousness. The psychological strain of maintaining belief in his own divinity while simultaneously fearing the god's potential wrath created an internal tension that many pharaohs found increasingly difficult to bear as they aged. The pharaoh's private chambers, when he finally retired for the night, were anything but peaceful refugees from the day's pressures. Guards maintained constant vigilance outside his door, while magical protections warded against supernatural threats that might strike while the divine ruler lay vulnerable in sleep. The royal bed was surrounded by amulets and talismans designed to prevent nightmares, demonic possession, and spiritual attacks from enemies, both living and dead. Even in sleep, the pharaoh could not escape his divine responsibilities, as his dreams were carefully monitored and interpreted by court magicians seeking signs of the god's will. The pharaoh's sleeping arrangements reflected the paranoia that necessarily accompanied absolute power. His bedchamber contained secret passages that could be used for quick escape in case of assassination attempts, while hidden compartments concealed weapons and emergency supplies. The bed itself was often carved with protective spells and positioned according to astronomical calculations that would maximize the pharaoh's connection to beneficial cosmic forces. Every night became a small death and rebirth, mirroring the sun, God's journey through darkness toward the light of a new dawn. Dreams held particular significance in the pharaoh's nightly experience, as they were believed to be direct communications from the divine realm. Court dream interpreters would analyze every detail of the pharaoh's nocturnal visions, seeking guidance for upcoming decisions or warnings about potential threats. The pressure to remember and accurately report these dreams added yet another layer of stress to the pharaoh's already burdened psyche, as a forgotten detail might mean missing a crucial divine message that could affect the kingdom's fate. The pharaoh's personal relationships suffered tremendously under the weight of these evening obligations and the constant awareness of his divine status. Genuine friendship was nearly impossible when every interaction carried political implications and potential consequences for the kingdom's stability. Even moments of apparent intimacy with wives or children were shadowed by the knowledge that their loyalty might be tested by competing interests or external pressures. The isolation inherent in divine kingship meant that the pharaoh often went to sleep each night, surrounded by people yet utterly alone in his cosmic responsibilities. Sleep itself became another performance of divine authority, as the pharaoh's rest was believed to merge his spiritual essence with that of the sun god during the dangerous nighttime journey through the underworld. Court astronomers would calculate the optimal times for the pharaoh to sleep and wake based on celestial movements, while priests performed protective rituals throughout the night to ensure his spiritual safety. The very act of closing his eyes became an act of faith in his own divinity and the cosmic order he was sworn to maintain. As dawn approached and the pharaoh prepared to wake and begin another day of divine service, the weight of eternal responsibility would settle upon him once again like his heavy ceremonial regalia. There would be no retirement from godhood, no vacation from cosmic duty, no escape from the crushing burden of maintaining order in a universe constantly threatened by the forces of chaos. The life of a pharaoh, for all its material splendor and absolute authority, was ultimately a gilded prison from which death offered the only possible release into an even more demanding eternal existence among the gods themselves. Now let's delve deeper into the suffocating weight of royal obligations that crushed the pharaoh's every waking moment. Imagine being trapped in an existence where even the simplest human pleasures became elaborate state ceremonies, where a casual meal transformed into a complex ritual involving dozens of servants, food tasters, and religious protocols that stretched for hours. The pharaoh could never simply wake up and decide what to wear. His clothing was selected according to astronomical calculations, seasonal religious requirements, and political symbolism that had been established for centuries. Each piece of jewelry, every fold of linen, the angle of his crown, all of these decisions were made by committees of priests and advisors who consulted ancient texts and divine omens. The pharaoh's body became a walking billboard for cosmic order, weighted down with gold and precious stones that served as protective amulets, but made simple movement exhausting. Consider the psychological toll of never being allowed genuine human connection. The pharaoh's conversations were scripted performances, where courtiers spoke only in formal phrases designed to reinforce his divine status. Nobody could look directly at his face, touch him without permission, or express disagreement with his opinions. He lived in a bubble of artificial reverence, where authentic relationships were impossible. Even his wives and children approached him with ceremonial protocols that maintained the fiction of his godhood. The constant surveillance was perhaps most maddening of all. Every word the pharaoh spoke was recorded by scribes, every gesture analyzed for signs of divine favor or displeasure. His food was prepared by trusted servants who had sworn sacred oaths, then tested by multiple tasters before reaching his lips. His sleeping quarters were guarded by loyal soldiers who watched him even in rest, ensuring that no assassin could approach, but also guaranteeing that privacy remained forever beyond his reach. The pharaoh's daily schedule resembled a military campaign more than a royal lifestyle. Dawn brought mandatory purification rituals that lasted 2 hours. Morning temple ceremonies required precise recitation of hundreds of hymns and prayers in ancient languages that had become increasingly archaic. Afternoon audiences with petitioners meant listening to endless disputes over property boundaries, trade agreements, and family inheritances, all while maintaining the appearance of omniscient wisdom. Evening banquets demanded performance of royal generosity while navigating complex webs of court politics where every conversation carried hidden meanings and potential traps. Physical discomfort was a constant companion. The heavy crowns caused chronic neck pain and headaches. The elaborate makeup and oils attracted swarms of insects that couldn't be swatted away without disrupting sacred symbolism. The formal regalia restricted movement so severely that pharaohs often suffered muscle atrophy and joint problems. Many developed peculiar walking gaits from years of wearing ceremonial sandals designed for symbolic rather than practical purposes. The intellectual isolation proved equally devastating. Royal education focused entirely on religious doctrine and ceremonial requirements rather than practical skills or creative pursuits. Pharaohs were discouraged from developing personal interests that might distract from their divine responsibilities. They couldn't pursue hobbies, travel for pleasure, or engage in casual learning. Their minds became repositories for ancient rituals, while their natural curiosity withered from lack of stimulation. Perhaps most crushing was the knowledge that this existence would continue until death brought either eternal paradise or eternal punishment. There was no retirement from godhood, no vacation from cosmic responsibility. Each day brought the same suffocating routine with only minor variations for seasonal festivals or political crises. The pharaoh's life stretched ahead like an endless corridor of golden cages, each more ornate but equally confining than the last. The psychological pressure manifested in various disturbing ways. Some pharaohs developed obsessive behaviors, arranging and rearranging their possessions according to complex magical formulas. Others became hypochondriacs, convinced that every minor ailment signaled divine displeasure or enemy sorcery. Many turned to alcohol or other substances to numb the constant anxiety of maintaining perfect divine performance. A few simply retreated into complete emotional detachment, becoming living statues who performed their duties with mechanical precision while their spirits withered away. The pharaoh's dreams offered no escape either. Ancient Egyptian texts describe how royal sleep was believed to be a time when the pharaoh's spirit communed with the gods, making even unconscious hours another form of religious duty. Dream interpreters analyzed every detail of the pharaoh's nighttime visions for prophetic significance. Nightmares were treated as cosmic warnings requiring elaborate purification ceremonies. Peaceful sleep became as elusive as privacy or genuine affection. Food, that most basic human pleasure, transformed into another source of stress and symbolism. Royal meals followed strict dietary laws based on seasonal religious requirements and magical correspondences. Certain foods were forbidden during specific lunar phases. Others had to be prepared according to recipes that dated back thousands of years. The pharaoh couldn't simply eat what he craved. Every bite carried religious and political implications that had to be carefully calculated by palace nutritionists who were also trained priests. Even reproduction, the fundamental drive that connects all living beings, became a matter of state policy rather than personal choice. The pharaoh's romantic relationships were arranged according to diplomatic necessity and genetic calculations designed to maintain royal bloodline purity. Love marriages were impossible when every union had to serve political alliance building or religious symbolism. The pressure to produce male heirs added another layer of performance anxiety to what should have been intimate moments. The pharaoh's children grew up knowing they were either future prisoners of the same system or potential threats to be eliminated if they showed too much ambition. Family dinners became exercises in succession planning, where siblings evaluated each other as competitors rather than developing normal familial bonds. The royal nursery was a training ground for future god kings, rather than a place where children could simply play and explore their developing personalities. As the pharaoh aged, the burden only intensified rather than diminishing. Elderly pharaohs were expected to maintain the same rigorous schedule of ceremonies and audiences despite declining physical capabilities. Signs of weakness or confusion were interpreted as cosmic disturbances, requiring immediate magical intervention. Death itself became another elaborate performance where the pharaoh had to demonstrate proper spiritual preparation, while his body failed, and his mind grappled with the ultimate uncertainty of what lay beyond the elaborate promises of eternal paradise. In the end, the pharaoh's existence reveals the ultimate paradox of absolute power. The more control one theoretically possesses over others, the less control one actually has over one's own life. These god kings who commanded millions found themselves enslaved by the very system that elevated them above ordinary humanity. Their golden prisons were more beautiful than any commoner's humble dwelling. But prisons nonetheless, where the bars were made of ritual obligation and the guards were cosmic forces that demanded perfect compliance until the final breath. Now, as we delve deeper into the daily realities that govern these divine rulers, we must examine the intricate web of obligations and restrictions that bound them more tightly than any prison walls. For behind the glittering facade of absolute power lay an existence so rigidly controlled, so thoroughly prescribed by ancient protocol, that even the most basic human freedoms were denied to those who wore the double crown. The pharaoh's morning awakening was never a private affair. Before the first rays of Ra emerged over the eastern horizon, a carefully selected team of servants would already be stationed outside the royal bedchamber, their movements choreographed by centuries of tradition. The chief chamberlain, a position of immense responsibility, typically held by a trusted eunuch, would enter the pharaoh's private quarters precisely at the moment when astronomical calculations determined the sun. God began his daily journey across the heavens. This timing was no mere convenience, but a sacred imperative. The pharaoh, as the earthly incarnation of Horus and the son of Ra, was mystically linked to the solar cycle. To rise before the proper moment would suggest an unseemly eagerness that diminished his divine dignity. To sleep beyond it would imply a failure in his cosmic duties that could theoretically disrupt the very foundations of creation. The pressure of such responsibility weighed heavily on every pharaoh, knowing that even their sleep patterns carried implications for the stability of the known world. The awakening ritual itself was an elaborate ceremony that could consume the better part of an hour. The pharaoh was not simply roused from sleep, but symbolically reborn each dawn, reenacting the sun god's emergence from the underworld. Soft chanting filled the chamber as priests recited the appropriate hymns, their voices harmonizing with the gentle tinkling of sistrum rattles and the whispered prayers of the attending servants. As consciousness returned to the divine ruler, he was not permitted the luxury of stretching or yawning, those most human of responses to awakening. Instead, he must maintain perfect composure from the moment his eyes opened, for to display any sign of mortality or weakness, even in the privacy of his own chambers, was to risk undermining the carefully constructed fiction of his divinity. The servants watched his every movement for signs of illness or distress, ready to summon physicians or priests if the pharaoh showed any indication that his divine essence might be compromised. The cleansing ritual that followed was perhaps the most psychologically demanding aspect of the pharaoh's morning routine. Every inch of his body had to be washed according to precise specifications, using water that had been blessed by temple priests and scented with oils whose formulations were jealously guarded secrets passed down through generations of royal perfumers. The pharaoh was required to remain perfectly still throughout this process, his arms positioned at specific angles, his breathing regulated according to ancient prescriptions. But the true torment lay not in the physical discomfort of maintaining these rigid poses, but in the complete lack of privacy they represented. The pharaoh's body, supposedly sacred and divine, was handled by dozens of servants, whose very presence was a constant reminder that he belonged not to himself, but to the institution of kingship. Every scar, every blemish, every sign of aging was catalogued and discussed among the attending physicians, their observations carefully recorded for future reference. The application of cosmetics that followed was equally elaborate and invasive. The famous kohl that lined the pharaoh's eyes was not merely decorative, but served multiple symbolic and practical purposes. The dark pigment, made from galena and other minerals, was believed to provide magical protection against the evil eye, while also reducing glare from the harsh Egyptian sun. But the application process required the pharaoh to remain motionless for extended periods, while skilled artisans painted intricate designs around his eyes, each stroke carrying religious significance that had been codified centuries earlier. The perfuming of the royal body involved oils and unguents whose exotic origins spoke to Egypt's vast trading networks. Frankincense from the mysterious land of Punt, myrrh from the southern reaches of Nubia, and rare spices from distant Mesopotamian markets were blended according to secret formulas that supposedly imbued the pharaoh with supernatural charisma and divine favor. Yet the application of these precious substances was another ordeal of enforced passivity, as teams of servants massaged the oils into every inch of the royal flesh, while the pharaoh was required to meditate on his sacred duties rather than acknowledge the physical sensations of the process. The dressing of the pharaoh was perhaps the most symbolically complex aspect of the morning routine. Each garment carried layers of meaning that extended far beyond mere fashion or comfort. The finest linen, bleached to a purity that rivaled fresh snow, represented the pharaoh's spiritual cleanliness and his connection to the pristine realm of the gods. But this same linen, despite its luxury, was notoriously fragile and required constant adjustment throughout the day. The pharaoh could never move naturally or spontaneously for fear of damaging the delicate fabric that was itself a symbol of his divine status. The jewelry and regalia that completed the royal ensemble transformed the pharaoh from a mere man into a walking symbol of cosmic authority. The weight of the various crowns, collars, and ceremonial weapons was considerable, often totaling more than 50 pounds of gold, precious stones, and sacred metals. The physical burden was matched by the psychological pressure of wearing objects that had been blessed by generations of priests and were believed to contain fragments of divine power. Each piece had to be donned in a specific sequence, with appropriate prayers and incantations accompanying every stage of the process. The famous double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, was so heavy and unwieldy that it required a specially trained servant to support it whenever the pharaoh needed to turn his head. The ceremonial beard, made of braided human hair and secured with precious metal clasps, caused constant discomfort, but could never be adjusted or removed during public appearances. The pharaoh's breakfast, when it finally arrived, was less a meal than another religious ceremony. Every morsel of food had to be blessed by priests, tested for poison by official tasters, and presented according to strict protocols that governed everything from the order in which dishes were served to the precise angle at which serving vessels were held. The pharaoh was required to eat with ritual implements rather than his hands, and even the act of chewing had to be performed with dignity befitting a divine ruler. But perhaps most psychologically taxing was the requirement that the pharaoh express gratitude for every aspect of this elaborate morning routine. He was expected to praise the servants for their diligent service, thank the priests for their spiritual guidance, and acknowledge the gods for granting him another day of divine existence. This performance of contentment and satisfaction had to be maintained regardless of the pharaoh's actual feelings, creating a constant tension between his human emotions and his royal obligations. As the morning routine finally concluded and the pharaoh prepared to emerge from his private chambers to begin the public portions of his day, he carried with him the accumulated stress of hours spent submitting to the demands of protocol and tradition. The magnificent figure that stepped forth to greet his courtiers and subjects bore little resemblance to the vulnerable human being who had awakened in the pre-dawn darkness. The transformation was complete, but the cost in terms of personal autonomy and psychological well-being was enormous. This pattern would repeat itself throughout every hour of the pharaoh's waking existence, from the elaborate rituals of temple worship to the stilted formalities of court audiences. Each activity, no matter how mundane, was governed by ancient prescriptions that prioritized symbolic significance over human comfort or natural behavior. The pharaoh lived every moment of his life as a performance, with the stakes being nothing less than the stability of the cosmic order itself. The dining experiences of a pharaoh, while undoubtedly luxurious by any standard, were transformed into elaborate theatrical productions that bore little resemblance to the simple act of nourishment. Every meal became a complex negotiation between the demands of protocol, the requirements of security, and the endless symbolic interpretations that surrounded the divine ruler's relationship with food and sustenance. The preparation of royal meals began hours before the pharaoh was scheduled to eat, with teams of cooks, priests, and security officials working in careful coordination to ensure that every aspect of the dining experience met the exacting standards required for divine consumption. The ingredients themselves were sourced from across the Egyptian empire and beyond, with certain foods reserved exclusively for royal use and others forbidden entirely based on complex religious taboos that varied according to the calendar, the pharaoh's current ritual status, and the political climate of the moment. But the true burden of royal dining lay not in the exotic nature of the cuisine, but in the suffocating web of restrictions and obligations that surrounded every bite. The pharaoh could never eat spontaneously or according to his own appetite. Instead, every meal was scheduled according to astronomical calculations and religious requirements that took precedence over any consideration of hunger or personal preference. Some days, the pharaoh might be required to fast entirely as part of his religious duties, while on others, he might be obligated to consume specific foods regardless of his inclinations. The dining chamber itself was arranged according to strict protocols that reinforced the pharaoh's isolation even in the midst of apparent sociability. While courtiers and foreign dignitaries might be present, they were seated at carefully calculated distances that reflected their relative status and the current state of their relationships with the crown. The pharaoh sat elevated above all others, his position marking him as separate from and superior to even his most trusted advisors. The morning ritual begins before dawn in the pre-dawn hours when the palace remains shrouded in darkness and silence. Even the pharaoh's awakening follows precise ceremonial protocols. Specially trained servants known as purifiers approach the royal bedchamber carrying sacred oils and implements blessed by temple priests. The pharaoh must never wake naturally, but instead be gently roused through the burning of specific incenses whose smoke patterns are interpreted for omens about the coming day. The first conscious moments of each day require the pharaoh to recite protection spells while still lying prone. His feet must touch the floor in a predetermined sequence, right foot first, followed by the left, while facing eastward toward the rising sun. Servants immediately drape him in preliminary robes of white linen, symbolizing purity and rebirth. No word can be spoken by anyone until the pharaoh utters the daily renewal oath, pledging to uphold Maat and serve the gods faithfully. The bathing ceremony that follows involves water drawn exclusively from sacred pools within the palace complex. This water has been blessed by priests of Sobek, the crocodile god, and must be precisely heated to match the temperature of blood. As servants pour the sacred water over the pharaoh's body, they chant protective hymns while carefully watching for any unusual ripples or patterns in the water that might indicate divine displeasure. The pharaoh's skin is then anointed with oils imported from distant lands, each drop applied according to ancient formulas passed down through generations of palace cosmeticians. Every aspect of the pharaoh's grooming carries religious significance. His fingernails and toenails are trimmed only during specific lunar phases, and the clippings must be carefully collected and burned in temple fires to prevent their use in hostile magic. The shaving of his head and face requires razors blessed by temple metal workers, and the process must be completed in total silence to avoid disturbing the spiritual energies that flow through the royal skull. The application of kohl around the pharaoh's eyes serves both practical and mystical purposes. The dark pigment protects against the harsh desert sun, while also creating a connection to the eye of Horus, symbol of divine protection and royal power. The kohl must be applied in specific patterns that mirror hieroglyphic symbols for eternity and divine authority. Similarly, the red ochre painted on his lips represents the life-giving power of blood and must be applied while reciting spells for eloquence and persuasive speech. The selection and donning of royal garments follows equally complex protocols. The pharaoh's clothing is stored in cedar chests lined with gold and precious stones to prevent contamination by evil spirits. Each garment has been woven from linen grown in fields blessed by priests of Renenutet, the harvest goddess, and treated with protective amulets sewn into the fabric. The process of dressing requires multiple servants working in careful coordination to ensure that no garment touches the ground or becomes tangled, which would be interpreted as an omen of chaos threatening the kingdom. The pharaoh's jewelry and regalia carry the weight of centuries of accumulated spiritual power. The famous double crown combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt must be placed upon his head by the high priest of Ptah, while specific incantations are recited. The crown's weight often exceeds 10 pounds, and its placement requires perfect balance to avoid the catastrophic omen of it falling. The crook and flail symbols of the pharaoh's role as shepherd and judge of his people are handed to him in a ceremony that reenacts the moment when Osiris first received these symbols of divine authority. Even the pharaoh's breakfast involves elaborate ritual considerations. Food is prepared by specially purified cooks who have undergone ritual cleansing and taken vows of silence. Every ingredient must be blessed and tested for both poison and spiritual contamination. The pharaoh eats alone while servants fan him with ostrich feathers, and musicians play sacred melodies designed to aid digestion and promote divine favor. The sequence in which foods are consumed follows ancient dietary laws that supposedly mirror the eating habits of the gods themselves. Following the morning meal, the pharaoh begins his daily rounds of religious obligations. The temple visits that consume much of his morning are not mere ceremonial appearances, but vital spiritual work believed necessary for maintaining the cosmic order. At each temple, the pharaoh must perform specific rituals appropriate to the resident deity. These ceremonies often involve the symbolic feeding of god statues, the burning of precious incenses, and the recitation of hymns whose words must be pronounced with perfect accuracy to maintain their magical effectiveness. The political aspects of the pharaoh's morning routine prove equally demanding and ritualized. The daily audience with advisors follows strict protocols about who may speak when and in what order. The vizier presents reports on provincial administration, tax collection, and legal matters, while the high priest delivers assessments of religious affairs and omens. Military commanders provide updates on border security and foreign threats, while scribes read diplomatic correspondence from allied kingdoms and vassal states. Throughout these morning activities, the pharaoh must maintain perfect composure and demonstrate the wisdom expected of a divine ruler. His responses to various reports and recommendations are carefully observed by courtiers for signs of divine inspiration or concerning changes in temperament. The slightest display of uncertainty or emotion can trigger speculation about the pharaoh's spiritual condition and his continued fitness to serve as intermediary between gods and mortals. The transition from morning religious duties to daytime administrative responsibilities requires its own ceremonial protocols. The pharaoh must change from his temple garments into administrative robes, while priests perform purification rituals to cleanse him of any spiritual energies that might interfere with worldly decision-making. This changing ceremony takes place in a special chamber decorated with images of Thoth, the god of wisdom and justice, to invoke divine guidance for the secular challenges ahead. The pharaoh's midday activities center around the formal court sessions, where he receives petitioners, hears legal cases, and makes pronouncements on matters of state policy. These sessions take place in the great throne room, where every architectural element serves to reinforce the pharaoh's divine authority and overwhelming power. The throne itself stands on a raised platform requiring petitioners to approach by climbing steps that symbolize their ascent toward divine wisdom. The walls display painted scenes of the pharaoh smiting enemies and receiving tribute from foreign lands, creating a visual narrative of royal dominance and divine favor. The handling of legal cases reveals the complex intersection of religious belief and practical governance that characterized pharaonic rule. The pharaoh serves as the ultimate judge in all disputes, but his decisions must align with the principles of Ma'at, while also considering the practical implications for royal authority and social stability. Court scribes carefully record not only the pharaoh's judgments, but also his reasoning, and any omens or divine signs that influence his decisions. These records serve as precedents for future cases and help maintain consistency in royal justice. Foreign diplomatic affairs demand particularly careful attention as they involve complex considerations of military strategy, economic benefit, and religious propriety. Ambassadors from neighboring kingdoms present tribute and negotiate treaties, while the pharaoh must balance Egypt's interests against the need to maintain divine favor and cosmic harmony. The reception of foreign dignitaries follows elaborate protocols designed to demonstrate Egyptian superiority while avoiding actions that might provoke divine wrath or upset the cosmic balance. The afternoon hours bring different challenges as the pharaoh turns his attention to the massive construction projects that serve to glorify his reign and prepare for his eventual transition to the afterlife. The planning and oversight of pyramid construction, temple building, and tomb preparation require constant attention to both practical engineering concerns and religious requirements. Architects and engineers present progress reports and technical challenges, while priests ensure that all construction activities align with sacred principles and astronomical observations. The pharaoh's involvement in construction projects extends beyond simple approval or disapproval to detailed participation in design decisions and ritual considerations. The orientation of buildings must align with celestial events and sacred directions, while decorative programs must accurately represent religious themes and royal achievements. The selection of materials involves considerations of both practical durability and spiritual significance, with certain stones and metals believed to possess specific magical properties essential for the building's religious functions. As afternoon transitions toward evening, the pharaoh's duties shift toward more personal and family-oriented activities, though even these remain heavily ritualized and politically significant. Time spent with the royal family involves complex protocols about precedence, respect, and the maintenance of royal dignity. Interactions with queens and children serve multiple purposes, including the demonstration of royal fertility, the reinforcement of dynastic continuity, and the cultivation of political alliances within the extended royal family. The pharaoh's relationships with his numerous wives and concubines require careful management to avoid favoritism that might destabilize the royal household or create succession crises. Each wife represents different political and diplomatic considerations, with marriages often serving to cement alliances with powerful noble families or foreign kingdoms. The pharaoh must balance personal preferences against political necessities, while maintaining the religious requirements for royal marriages and the production of legitimate heirs. Evening meal preparations involve even more elaborate rituals than the morning breakfast, as the day's accumulated spiritual energies must be properly channeled and purified. The pharaoh's dinner typically includes foods from across the Egyptian empire, demonstrating the reach of royal power, while also serving religious purposes through the symbolic consumption of offerings blessed by various regional deities. The meal itself becomes a communion with divine forces, as each course represents different aspects of cosmic harmony and royal responsibility. The evening's entertainment provides one of the few opportunities for the pharaoh to experience something approaching normal human pleasure, though even recreational activities remain bounded by protocol and religious consideration. Musical performances, dancing exhibitions, and storytelling sessions serve not only to amuse the royal court, but also to reinforce cultural values and religious beliefs. The selection of entertainers and their performances must align with royal dignity, while avoiding content that might be interpreted as disrespectful to the gods or threatening to royal authority. As night approaches, the pharaoh begins the complex process of preparing for sleep, which involves its own elaborate ceremonies and protective rituals. The royal bedchamber must be purified with incense and protective amulets, while priests perform evening prayers designed to guard the pharaoh's dreams and ensure peaceful rest. The pharaoh's sleeping garments are specially blessed, and his bed is arranged according to ancient formulas believed to promote prophetic dreams and divine communication. The transition into sleep represents one of the most vulnerable periods in the pharaoh's daily cycle, as the sleeping mind becomes accessible to hostile spiritual forces and malevolent magic. Protective spells are carved into the bed frame and headrest, while guard priests maintain vigil throughout the night to watch for signs of spiritual attack or divine visitation. The pharaoh's dreams are considered important sources of divine guidance and prophetic insight, requiring careful interpretation by trained specialists who analyze dream symbolism for messages from the gods. Throughout this entire daily routine, from dawn awakening to nighttime slumber, the pharaoh remains trapped within a rigid framework of expectations and obligations that leave little room for spontaneous action or personal expression. Every moment carries the weight of cosmic significance, while every decision potentially affects the welfare of the entire kingdom and the favor of the gods. The pharaoh's life becomes a carefully choreographed performance in which any misstep could trigger catastrophic consequences for both the ruler and his people. The psychological toll of maintaining this constant divine performance would have been enormous, requiring exceptional mental discipline and emotional control. The pharaoh could never truly relax or drop his guard, as even private moments remained subject to observation and interpretation by those around him. The isolation inherent in divine kingship meant that genuine human connection became nearly impossible, as all relationships were filtered through considerations of protocol, political advantage, and religious propriety. This relentless pressure to embody divine perfection while managing the practical challenges of governing a complex empire created conditions that inevitably fostered both megalomania and paranoia among pharaonic rulers. The constant reinforcement of royal supremacy and divine status could easily lead to delusions of omnipotence, while the ever-present threats of political intrigue and spiritual attack encouraged suspicion and fear. The pharaoh's absolute power became both his greatest asset and his most dangerous liability, as it removed normal human constraints while amplifying the consequences of poor judgment or moral failure. The daily routine we have examined reveals the profound contradiction at the heart of pharaonic existence: the simultaneous elevation to godlike status and enslavement to crushing obligations and expectations. The pharaoh wielded unprecedented power and enjoyed unimaginable luxury, yet remained trapped within a system that demanded constant performance and perfect adherence to ancient protocols. This golden cage of divine kingship created conditions that could transform ordinary human beings into either enlightened rulers or tyrannical monsters, depending on their personal character and ability to handle the immense pressures of their position. The legacy of these daily rituals and obligations extends far beyond their immediate religious and political purposes to reveal fundamental truths about the nature of absolute power and its effects on human psychology. The pharaoh's routine demonstrates how systems designed to elevate and protect rulers can simultaneously isolate and constrain them, creating the very conditions that often lead to the abuse of power and the corruption of leadership. In seeking to create perfect divine rulers,
Ancient Egypt inadvertently constructed a machine for producing either saints or tyrants, with little middle ground between these extremes. The pharaoh's awakening began each day precisely at dawn, not by choice, but by the rigid demands of cosmic duty. As the first pale light crept across the eastern desert, a carefully orchestrated symphony of ritual commenced within the palace walls. Servants moved through corridors with practiced silence, their bare feet whispering against cool limestone floors as they prepared for the divine awakening of their living god. The pharaoh's bedchamber was a marvel of symbolic architecture. Every surface bore hieroglyphic inscriptions invoking protection from the night demons and malevolent spirits that prowled the hours of darkness. Golden ankhs gleamed from wall niches, while painted eyes of Horus gazed eternally from ceiling frescoes, ensuring divine surveillance over the sleeping god-king. The bed itself was an ornate construction of ebony and gold, its headboard carved with scenes of the pharaoh receiving life from the gods. Upon awakening, the pharaoh could not simply rise and begin his day. Every movement was prescribed by centuries of religious protocol. He must first extend his right hand toward the east, acknowledging Ra's triumphant emergence from the underworld. Only then could he place his feet upon the floor, right foot first, to ward off the chaos that perpetually threatened to engulf the ordered world. The simple act of standing required the recitation of a brief prayer, thanking the gods for another day of divine existence. The morning ablutions that followed were perhaps the most elaborate personal hygiene routine in human history. A procession of servants entered the chamber bearing copper vessels filled with sacred water, drawn from specific locations along the Nile. This was not ordinary water, but liquid that had been blessed by priests and infused with protective spells. The pharaoh's body was washed with meticulous care, each limb cleansed according to ritual specifications, while priests chanted incantations to purify both flesh and spirit.
The application of cosmetics served purposes far beyond vanity or beauty. Kohl was carefully applied around the pharaoh's eyes in precise patterns that mimicked the sacred eye of Horus. This black antimony mixture not only protected against the harsh desert glare, but also served as a magical shield against evil influences. Green malachite was dusted on the eyelids to invoke the protection of Wadjet, the cobra goddess of Lower Egypt. Every stroke of the cosmetic brush was a deliberate act of spiritual armoring. The pharaoh's hair, if he possessed any, was shaved completely away each morning. This practice served both practical and religious purposes. Practically, it eliminated the possibility of lice or other parasites that could compromise the divine person. Religiously, the clean-shaven head represented rebirth and renewal, allowing the pharaoh to emerge each day as pure as a newborn deity. In place of natural hair, elaborate wigs of human hair were carefully positioned, often incorporating gold threads and precious stones that caught the light and enhanced the pharaoh's supernatural radiance. The process of dressing the pharaoh required a small army of specialists, each responsible for specific garments or accessories. The finest linen, woven to gossamer thinness and bleached to brilliant white, was wrapped around the royal form in complex patterns that held both practical and mystical significance. The pleating of these garments followed mathematical principles that reflected cosmic harmony, with each fold positioned to channel divine energy through the pharaoh's body. The selection and placement of jewelry transformed the pharaoh into a living constellation of precious metals and gemstones. Gold, the flesh of the gods, adorned his throat, wrists, and fingers in intricate designs that told stories of divine kingship. lapis lazuli, imported at enormous expense from distant Afghanistan, provided the deep blue of the heavens. Carnelian offered the protective red of life's blood, while turquoise evoked the life-giving waters of the Nile. Each piece was not merely decorative, but served as a conduit for divine power, protecting and empowering the wearer. The crowns of Egypt were perhaps the most psychologically imposing elements of pharaonic regalia. The double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt with the red crown of Lower Egypt, weighed several pounds and required careful balance to wear with dignity. Its symbolic weight was far greater than its physical mass, representing the unification of the two lands under divine authority. The uraeus, a golden cobra that reared from the crown's front, was believed to spit fire at the pharaoh's enemies, making the crown itself a weapon of supernatural warfare. Once fully attired in his divine regalia, the pharaoh would consume his morning meal, though even this simple act was governed by elaborate protocol. The food had been prepared by specially purified cooks using ingredients that had been blessed and tested for poison. The pharaoh ate with his left hand only, keeping his right hand free for greeting the gods. Each bite was a communion with the divine, transforming earthly sustenance into spiritual nourishment. Wine was mixed with specific proportions of water and honey, creating a libation worthy of divine consumption. The pharaoh's first public appearance of the day was his emergence from the palace to greet the rising sun. This was not a casual stroll, but a carefully choreographed ceremony that reinforced his divine nature before any human observers. As he stepped into the morning light, priests would cry out, "Ra rises, Horus awakens," acknowledging the pharaoh's dual nature as both sun god and sky god. The assembled courtiers would prostrate themselves, not daring to look directly upon the divine radiance of their king. The morning temple ritual represented the pharaoh's most crucial daily duty. As the high priest of every temple in Egypt, he bore personal responsibility for maintaining the proper relationship between the divine and mortal realms. The temple's inner sanctuary, accessible only to the pharaoh and his designated priests, housed the cult statue of the deity. This statue was treated as a living being, requiring daily care and attention from the divine pharaoh. The awakening of the god statue paralleled the pharaoh's own morning routine. Sacred oils were applied to the statue's face and hands, while incense filled the chamber with fragrant smoke. The pharaoh would recite ancient hymns that had been passed down through millennia, each word precisely pronounced to maintain their magical efficacy. The offering of food and drink to the statue was followed by a ritual in which the pharaoh symbolically consumed the god's essence, strengthening his own divine nature. These morning temple duties could consume several hours, with the pharaoh moving from shrine to shrine within the complex, acknowledging each deity in turn. The precision required was exhausting, as any deviation from prescribed ritual could have catastrophic consequences. The priests observed every gesture, every intonation, ready to correct any error that might compromise the cosmic order. The pressure of performing these rituals perfectly, day after day, year after year, created an environment of constant anxiety beneath the veneer of divine confidence. Following his religious obligations, the pharaoh would transition to his role as supreme administrator of the Egyptian state. The throne room where he held court was designed to overwhelm visitors with its display of divine authority. Massive columns soared toward painted ceilings that depicted the pharaoh's victories over chaos and his eternal communion with the gods. The throne itself was a masterpiece of symbolic art, its arms carved in the shape of lions and its back adorned with the wings of protective goddesses. The daily audience session brought a parade of officials, petitioners, and foreign ambassadors before the divine presence. Each individual had to undergo purification rites before approaching the throne, and specific protocols governed how closely they could approach the pharaoh's sacred person. The vizier, serving as the pharaoh's voice in earthly matters, would present the day's business, while the pharaoh maintained the dignified silence befitting a deity, who spoke only when the cosmos required divine pronouncement. Legal cases brought before the pharaoh often involved matters of life and death, as his word carried the absolute authority of divine judgment. The concept of appeal or review was meaningless when the decision came from a living God. This awesome responsibility weighed heavily on even the most confident rulers, as they understood that their judgments would echo through eternity. The pharaoh's decisions on taxation, military campaigns, and trade policies affected millions of lives. Yet he was expected to render these verdicts with the infallible wisdom of divine omniscience. The administrative burden of governing ancient Egypt was staggering in its complexity. The pharaoh received reports on Nile flood levels, harvest yields, mining operations, and construction projects throughout the kingdom. Military commanders sought approval for troop movements and campaign strategies. Diplomatic correspondence arrived from vassal states and foreign powers, requiring careful consideration of Egypt's international relationships. Trade agreements, territorial disputes, and succession questions all demanded the pharaoh's attention and divine wisdom. The pharaoh's afternoon hours were often devoted to the monumental building projects that would ensure his eternal legacy. These were not mere construction sites, but sacred endeavors that channeled divine creative energy into permanent form. The pharaoh would review architectural plans, approve decorative programs, and inspect work in progress. Every detail required his approval, from the positioning of individual stones to the precise wording of hieroglyphic inscriptions. These buildings were meant to function for eternity, serving as earthly mansions for the pharaoh's divine spirit, long after his mortal form had been mummified and entombed. The scale of these projects reflected the pharaoh's unlimited access to human labor and natural resources. Thousands of workers toiled under the desert sun, quarrying stone, transporting massive blocks, and carving intricate decorations according to the pharaoh's vision. The pharaoh's word could redirect rivers, level mountains, and transform landscapes according to his divine will. Yet this awesome power came with the knowledge that every decision would be scrutinized by history and the gods themselves. As the day progressed, the pharaoh might engage in activities designed to demonstrate his superhuman abilities. Hunting expeditions showcased his mastery over the forces of nature, as he brought down lions, hippos, and other dangerous beasts from his speeding chariot. These hunts were carefully staged events, with beaters driving game toward the pharaoh's position and guards ensuring his safety. Yet they served important propaganda purposes. The pharaoh's victory over wild animals symbolized his triumph over the chaos that perpetually threatened civilized order. Athletic competitions provided another venue for displaying divine prowess. The pharaoh might demonstrate his archery skills by shooting arrows through copper targets, or display his strength by wrestling with carefully selected opponents. These contests were as much religious ritual as sporting event, with the pharaoh's victory predetermined by his divine nature. Yet the physical demands were real, and maintaining the appearance of superhuman ability required genuine athletic conditioning and skill. The evening meal represented a brief respite from the day's ceremonial demands, though even dining was governed by elaborate protocol. The pharaoh dined in splendid isolation or with carefully selected companions, served by an army of servants who had undergone purification rites. The menu featured delicacies from throughout the kingdom and beyond: roasted fowl stuffed with aromatic herbs, fresh fish from the Nile, fruits and vegetables from palace gardens, and exotic imports like cinnamon and pepper that demonstrated Egypt's far-reaching trade networks. Wine flowed freely during these evening repasts, though always mixed according to precise formulas that balanced pleasure with spiritual significance. The pharaoh's cup was made of gold and precious stones, and each draught was preceded by a brief libation to honor the gods. Even in relaxation, the pharaoh could never fully escape the weight of his divine responsibilities, as servants observed his every gesture and priests noted any deviation from prescribed behavior. Entertainment during the evening hours reflected the sophisticated artistic culture of the Egyptian court. Musicians played harps, lyres, and flutes, while dancers performed intricate routines that told stories of divine triumph and cosmic harmony. These performances were not mere diversion, but served religious purposes, recreating mythological narratives that reinforce the pharaoh's divine authority. The music and movement created a sacred atmosphere that transported the pharaoh and his guests into communion with the divine realm. The pharaoh's harem represented both pleasure and political necessity. Marriage alliances with foreign princesses cemented diplomatic relationships, while unions with Egyptian noblewomen strengthened domestic political bonds. The great royal wife held the highest status and would bear the pharaoh's primary heir, but numerous secondary wives and concubines provided both companionship and the possibility of additional sons to secure the succession. Managing these complex relationships required considerable diplomatic skill, as jealousy and intrigue constantly threatened to destabilize the royal household. The practice of royal incest, while shocking to modern sensibilities, served important religious and political functions in ancient Egypt. By marrying his sister or daughter, the pharaoh ensured that his heir would possess the purest possible divine bloodline. These unions emulated the mythological marriages of the gods themselves, particularly Osiris and Isis, who were both siblings and spouses. The theological justification for incest was unshakable. Only a god could be worthy of marrying another god, and the pharaoh's divine family members were the only suitable partners for divine union. The psychological toll of these incestuous relationships is difficult to assess from historical distance, but the genetic consequences were often severe. Many pharaohs suffered from congenital defects, chronic illnesses, and shortened lifespans that can be attributed to generations of inbreeding. Yet these physical problems were often interpreted as signs of divine favor, marking the pharaoh as too sacred for ordinary human existence. The suffering became another badge of divine status, separating the god-king from common mortality. As night fell over the palace, the pharaoh's day concluded with rituals designed to ensure his safe passage through the dangerous hours of darkness. The ancient Egyptians believed that night was when the forces of chaos grew strongest, requiring constant vigilance and magical protection. The pharaoh's bedchamber was warded with protective spells, and guards maintained watch throughout the night to defend against both human and supernatural threats. The pharaoh's sleep was not mere rest, but a form of mystical communion with the divine realm. Dreams were considered messages from the gods, requiring careful interpretation and response. Specialized priests maintained dream books that cataloged various visions and their meanings, helping the pharaoh understand the divine communications he received during sleep. Some dreams demanded immediate action, such as the construction of new temples or the initiation of military campaigns, making even unconscious hours a form of divine service. The pharaoh's bed was surrounded by magical objects designed to ensure peaceful sleep and protection from nightmares. Ivory headrests carved with protective deities supported his head, while amulets sewn into the bedding provided additional spiritual armor. Incense burned throughout the night, creating a sacred atmosphere that encouraged divine visitation while repelling malevolent spirits. Even in sleep, the pharaoh remained a conduit between the mortal and divine realms. This relentless cycle of ritual, ceremony, and divine obligation repeated itself day after day, year after year, for the duration of the pharaoh's reign. The magnificent lifestyle and absolute power came at the cost of personal freedom and authentic human experience. Every moment was scripted, every action observed and judged according to divine standards. The pharaoh lived in a gilded cage of his own divine status, magnificent but ultimately imprisoning. The cumulative effect of this lifestyle on the pharaoh's psychology was profound and often disturbing. The constant pressure to maintain divine perfection, combined with the isolation of supreme power, frequently produced rulers who were paranoid, megalomaniacal, or completely detached from human reality. Some pharaohs retreated into religious mysticism, others became increasingly tyrannical, and many developed obsessive behaviors related to death and the afterlife. The pharaoh's divine status created a fundamental paradox. While he possessed unlimited earthly power, he was simultaneously enslaved by the very system that elevated him above humanity. His every action was constrained by religious protocol, his relationships corrupted by political necessity, and his future dominated by preparations for death. The price of godhood was the loss of human authenticity, creating rulers who were simultaneously the most powerful and most pitiable figures in their society. As we consider the daily life of these ancient god-kings, we glimpse a world where power and paranoia walked hand in hand, where divine authority demanded the sacrifice of human connection and spontaneity. The pharaoh's existence was a performance that could never end, a role that consumed the actor until nothing remained but the mask of divinity. The psychological pressure of maintaining this facade of divine perfection created its own pathologies among the pharaohs. Many developed what we might today recognize as obsessive-compulsive behaviors, becoming fixated on ritual purity and ceremonial precision to a degree that bordered on madness. The pharaoh Akhenaten's radical religious reforms, for instance, may have stemmed from a psychological need to control every aspect of spiritual life, extending his divine authority into realms previously managed by the established priesthood. Paranoia was another The training and education of future pharaohs reflected society's understanding of the immense challenges they would face. Royal children were removed from normal family relationships at an early age and subjected to intensive instruction in religious ritual, administrative procedure, and military strategy. They learned multiple languages, studied astronomical calculations, and memorized vast collections of hymns and prayers. This education was designed to create rulers capable of managing the enormous complexity of pharaonic duty, but it also served to further isolate them from ordinary human experience. The pedagogical methods employed in royal education emphasized rote memorization and perfect execution rather than critical thinking or creative problem-solving. Future pharaohs learned that there was one correct way to perform each ritual, one proper response to each situation, one divine solution to every problem. This rigid approach to learning produced rulers who excelled at maintaining traditional systems, but often struggled when faced with unprecedented challenges that required innovative responses. Physical training formed another crucial component of royal education. Future pharaohs spent countless hours perfecting their archery, learning to drive chariots, and developing the athletic skills necessary for ceremonial hunts and military campaigns. They studied the art of warfare, not merely as generals, but as divine champions who would personally lead their armies against the forces of chaos. This martial training was considered essential for maintaining the pharaoh's image as a powerful warrior god capable of protecting Egypt from all threats. The religious education of royal heirs was perhaps the most intensive aspect of their preparation. They memorized thousands of hymns, prayers, and ritual formulations that would govern their daily activities as pharaoh. They studied the complex mythologies that explained their divine nature and learned to interpret dreams, omens, and other forms of divine communication. Most importantly, they internalized the belief that their personal conduct directly affected the stability of the cosmos, making every action a matter of universal significance. This educational process typically began in early childhood and continued until the moment of coronation. Royal tutors, drawn from the highest ranks of the priesthood and nobility, subjected their charges to a curriculum that would challenge even the most dedicated modern scholar. The pressure to excel was enormous, as failure to master these skills could result in cosmic catastrophe once the prince assumed the throne. Many royal heirs undoubtedly cracked under this pressure, though such failures were carefully concealed from public knowledge. The succession itself represented the culmination of this lengthy preparation, yet it also marked the beginning of an even more challenging phase of existence. The coronation ceremony transformed the heir from a highly trained human being into a living god, a metamorphosis that was both psychological and spiritual. The new pharaoh was literally believed to become divine during the coronation ritual, acquiring supernatural powers and cosmic as we've journeyed through the disturbing and dazzling world of ancient Egypt's god-kings. We've seen how the pharaohs lived lives that were simultaneously magnificent and monstrous, divine and deeply human. Their existence was an endless performance of perfection, a carefully choreographed dance between earthly power and cosmic responsibility that left little room for genuine human connection or personal freedom. The pharaohs achieved a kind of immortality, though perhaps not quite in the way they intended. While their elaborate tombs were plundered and their mummies scattered, their stories continue to captivate us thousands of years later. Through their monuments and myths, they've become eternal symbols of both human ambition and its ultimate limitations. What strikes me most profoundly about these ancient rulers is how their godlike power paradoxically made them prisoners of their own divine status. Every ritual had to be performed flawlessly, every decision carried cosmic weight, and every moment was scrutinized for signs of divine favor or displeasure. The very immortality they craved became a crushing burden that transformed them into living statues of perfect order and control. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their legacy isn't the human sacrifices or incestuous marriages, but rather how their absolute power corrupted their humanity. In their quest to become gods, they often lost touch with the very people they were meant to protect and serve. The gulf between divine pharaoh and common subject became an unbridgeable chasm filled with fear, superstition, and blind obedience. Yet for all their flaws and failings, the pharaohs remind us of something fundamentally human: our desire to leave a lasting mark on the world, to be remembered, to matter. Their colossal pyramids and golden treasures were elaborate expressions of the same hope that drives us all: that our lives have meaning beyond their brief span. In the end, the pharaohs achieved their greatest triumph not through divine magic or elaborate rituals, but through the simple power of storytelling. Their names still echo across the millennia: Ramesses, Cleopatra, Tutankhamun, Hatshepsut, each one a reminder that even the most absolute power cannot escape the fundamental truth of human mortality. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of those golden sands and towering monuments, of priests chanting in shadowy temples and queens plotting in perfumed chambers. The pharaohs may be gone, but their stories live on, whispering across the ages about the eternal dance between power and vulnerability, between our divine aspirations and our all-too-human limitations. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be more peaceful than any pharaoh ever knew, free from the golden chains of divinity and the endless burden of cosmic responsibility. The sun sets on ancient Egypt, but its mysteries continue to illuminate the darker corners of human nature and ambition.